Welcome to today's story, one that proves patience is the greatest weapon of all. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever worked your heart out for something, only to be tossed aside like you never mattered? What if I told you that sometimes, revenge isn't about fighting back immediately, but waiting for the perfect moment to strike? That's exactly what happened to Michael. He was loyal, hardworking, and dedicated, but his boss saw him as nothing more than an old man who had outlived his usefulness. Until one day. This is a story about betrayal, power, and the sweetest revenge. Let's begin. Michael had given 25 years of his life to the company. He wasn't just an employee, he had built this place from the ground up, pouring his sweat and time into making it successful. He had seen employees come and go, survived multiple economic crises, and had always been the one people relied on during tough times. But now, they acted as if he was just a burden. His boss, Richard, barely acknowledged his presence anymore. The younger employees snickered behind his back, whispering things like he's too old for this job or why is he even still here. He heard it all, but he never reacted. He had learned long ago that silence was the best armor. Then came the real slap in the face. On a Monday morning, Richard called him into his office. Michael sat across from him, feeling the usual tension in the air. Richard leaned back in his chair with a smug look. "Mike, you've been with us for a long time," he said, pretending to sound appreciative. "But we need fresh ideas, younger minds. You understand, right?" Michael knew exactly where this was going. "I need you to train someone. A new guy. He'll be handling your work soon." Michael clenched his jaw. His replacement. He took a deep breath and nodded. "Of course." Richard smirked. "I knew you'd be a team player." The next day, the new guy arrived, Ryan. He was in his late 20s, cocky, and full of arrogance. The kind of guy who thought he knew everything. Michael greeted him politely, but Ryan barely looked at him. "So, you're the guy I'm replacing?" he asked, smirking. Michael didn't react. He simply began showing him the ropes, explaining processes, sharing insights that took him decades to master. Ryan wasn't interested. He cut him off mid-sentence. Yeah, I'll figure it out. You old guys love to complicate things." Michael felt something burn inside him, but he didn't respond. He continued with the training. As the week went on, Ryan's disrespect only grew. He made jokes in front of other employees, rolling his eyes whenever Michael spoke. "Man, things must have been slow back in your day," he laughed once, making the others chuckle. Michael took it all in silence. But inside, he was fuming. He wasn't just angry, he was planning. Friday morning, Michael received an unexpected email from HR. Meeting at 2 p.m. with the executive board. Attendance required. His gut told him something was off. After 25 years, he had never been called to an executive meeting before. The wording was vague, but the tone felt forced, almost rehearsed. He had seen enough in life to know when something was being staged. Still, he played along. At exactly 2 p.m., Michael walked into the conference room. The atmosphere was tense, fake smiles plastered across the faces of Richard and the other higher-ups. "Michael, please, have a seat," Richard said, gesturing towards a chair at the center of the room. Michael noticed how everyone else was already seated, as if they had been waiting for him. He took his place, keeping his face unreadable. "Michael, we called you in today because we want to talk about your future here," Richard began, folding his hands together like a man delivering good news. Michael nodded, waiting. "You've been with us for a long time," Richard continued, his voice oozing fake sympathy. "And we all respect your dedication. Truly, we do. Michael almost smirked. Respect? That was a good joke. But, Richard went on, exchanging a glance with HR, we believe it's time for some fresh blood in leadership. The industry is changing, and we need younger minds, more adaptable individuals. There it was. The betrayal laid out like a script. HR slid a folder across the table. Michael didn't touch it. We're letting you go, Richard finally said, leaning back with an air of finality. The room went silent. Michael looked at their faces, none of them showed regret. Some looked awkward, some relieved. But Richard was enjoying this. Then came the final insult. You understand, right? Richard said with a smirk. You had a good run, but this is business. You should be proud of what you've contributed. The room chuckled softly, as if they had just retired an old office chair. Michael didn't flinch. He let the silence stretch long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then, without a word, he stood up. He buttoned his jacket, picked up the termination letter, and walked out. No arguments. No pleading. No reaction. As he stepped out of the office, his mind wasn't dwelling on the humiliation. He wasn't even thinking about the sneers behind his back. He was thinking about the power they had just handed him. Because what they didn't know, what they never bothered to learn, was that Michael wasn't just an employee. He was their biggest investor. He owned 51% of the company. And now? It was time to play. Michael stepped out of the office building, the cold breeze hitting his face as he walked toward his car. He should have felt humiliated, broken even. Instead, he felt powerful. Because while Richard and his team thought they had won, they had no idea who they were dealing with. As he drove home, memories of the past 25 years played in his mind. The long nights, the sacrifices, the dedication, he had given his all to this company. But unlike the fools who had just fired him, he had planned for the future. Flashback, 15 years ago. At the time, Michael was just another hard-working employee, doing his best to secure a comfortable life. But he wasn't blind, he had seen how corporate politics worked. He knew that loyalty meant nothing when power and greed took over. So, he started planning. Instead of wasting his earnings on luxuries, he invested. First, it was stocks. He studied the market, made smart moves, and turned small investments into substantial gains. Then came real estate. While his colleagues spent their bonuses on expensive cars and vacations, Michael bought properties. He rented them out, flipped houses, and built wealth silently. But his biggest move? Tech startups. While the world was focused on traditional businesses, Michael saw the future in technology. He found young entrepreneurs with brilliant ideas and invested in them before they became giants. Some failed, but the ones that succeeded made him millions. By the time he turned 55, Michael was no longer just an employee. He was a silent billionaire. With his fortune growing, he made his most calculated decision yet. He started buying shares in his own company. But he was smart. He didn't buy them under his name. Instead, he used different accounts, different entities, offshore investments, making sure no one noticed. And then, just a few years ago, he crossed the 51% ownership mark. He became the majority shareholder. The real owner of the company. And yet, not a single person in that office had a clue. Back to the present. Michael pulled into his driveway, stepped out of his car, and exhaled deeply. He checked his phone. A notification from his investment firm flashed on the screen. Company stocks, down 3%. Interesting, he murmured, a smirk forming on his lips. Richard had no idea that he had just fired the one man who held his fate in his hands. Michael poured himself a drink, sat down in his study, and picked up his phone. It was time to make some calls. The game had begun. Michael leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of his whiskey glass. The weight of what had just happened didn't bother him, it excited him. They thought they had one. They thought he was just some old man, tossed aside like yesterday's news. They had no idea that, at this very moment, he was planning their downfall. He picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. The line barely rang before a sharp voice answered. "Michael, I was expecting your call." It was Daniel Carter, his personal lawyer, the man who had helped him build his empire in secret. "It's time," Michael said simply. There was a pause. Then, a quiet chuckle. Finally. Within the next 24 hours, Michael's financial team was in motion. First, he instructed his brokers to start slowly offloading shares. Not enough to cause a panic, just enough to make investors nervous. Within 2 days, the stock price dipped. At the same time, he froze new funding approvals that the company had been waiting on, loans, contracts, and investments that had been greenlit under his authority as majority shareholder. Inside the company, chaos was beginning. But Richard? He was too arrogant to see it. He was too busy celebrating, enjoying his so-called victory. He walked around the office with his chest puffed out, boasting about modernizing the company now that Michael was gone. Meanwhile, Ryan, the so-called replacement, was drowning. He had no idea how to handle Michael's responsibilities. Reports piled up, clients grew frustrated, and deadlines were missed. Employees who once respected Michael now whispered in the hallways, shaking their heads at Ryan's incompetence. "Just send the reports to me, and I'll approve them," Ryan had said on his first day. But now? He didn't even understand the reports. One by one, clients started pulling out. It was happening exactly as Michael had planned. And Richard? He laughed off the warning signs. When the CFO mentioned the declining stock value, Richard waved him off. "It's a market fluctuation. Nothing to worry about." When the head of sales mentioned that long-time clients were complaining, Richard scoffed. "They'll adjust. We have fresh leadership now." He had no idea the storm was already here. Michael watched it all unfold from a distance, his moves calculated, his timing precise. He wasn't finished yet. Michael sat in his home office, staring at the live stock updates on his screen. Every few minutes, a new red mark appeared, a sign that his plan was working. Stock price, down 7%. Investor confidence, low. The numbers were falling, and inside the company, panic was setting in. Michael took a sip of his coffee, watching as the pieces crumbled. It was almost too easy. Inside the company, Richard stormed into the executive meeting room, his face red with frustration. The once confident boss was now sweating. "What the hell is going on?" he barked. The CFO looked uneasy. "We've lost 3 major investors in the last 2 days. They're pulling their money, fast." "Why?" Richard demanded. "We haven't done anything wrong." The room went silent. The executives exchanged nervous glances, no one wanting to speak first. Finally, one of them cleared his throat. "It's the leadership change, sir. Clients and investors trusted Michael. They're uneasy now that he's gone." Richard slammed his fist on the table. "That old man? He was holding us back. This is supposed to be a new era." But deep down, doubt started creeping in. Why was everything collapsing so fast? Meanwhile, the office was falling apart. Deadlines were being missed. Clients were threatening to leave. Employees were terrified of losing their jobs. Ryan, the so-called replacement, was drowning. He had no idea how to handle client relationships. He messed up reports, ignored emails, and made bad decisions. People no longer saw him as the young, fresh leader. They saw him as a joke. "I wasn't trained for this," he whined in frustration. "I thought this job was just approving things and making presentations." People rolled their eyes behind his back. Everyone missed Michael now. By the end of the week, the company was in full crisis mode. More investors started pulling out. The stock price kept crashing. The media started noticing. Business articles began running headlines like, "Company in crisis, sudden leadership change leads to financial disaster." Richard couldn't ignore it anymore. Late one night, he sat alone in his office, staring at the financial reports. His fingers drummed anxiously on the desk. "This isn't just bad luck," he muttered. "Someone was doing this on purpose." But who? Who had the power to tear the company apart from the inside? The office felt like a war zone. People moved in frantic chaos, whispers of panic spreading like wildfire. The usual energy of employees working at their desks was replaced with fear, uncertainty, and resentment. Another email popped up in Richard's inbox. Another resignation. That made it 7 employees quitting in 2 days. "We can't keep losing people like this." Richard growled, rubbing his temples. "What's happening?" His HR director, a nervous-looking woman, hesitated before speaking. "Sir, they're leaving because they've lost faith in leadership. They're saying the company is falling apart." Richard clenched his jaw. Falling apart? No. That couldn't be true. But the signs were everywhere. Clients were pulling their contracts without warning. Investors had completely abandoned the company. The stock price had fallen by 60%. And worst of all, Ryan, the so-called replacement, was a complete disaster. Ryan's incompetence exposed. Ryan had no idea what he was doing. He was supposed to be leading, but instead, he was making things worse. Example 1, he approved a budget cut for customer service. Now the clients were furious because no one was responding to their complaints. Example 2, he tried to change the pricing models, but messed up the numbers, leading to a loss of millions in potential revenue. Example 3, he missed an important contract renewal deadline, and the company lost one of its biggest clients. Employees now openly mocked him. No one respected him. One day, in the middle of a meeting, a senior manager lost patience and snapped. "Ryan, do you even know what you're doing? Or are you just pressing buttons and hoping for the best?" The entire room went silent. Ryan's face turned red. Richard had to step in to save him. But in truth, even he was starting to regret hiring Ryan. By the end of the month, it was official. The company was on the edge of bankruptcy. News headlines were brutal. From success to disaster, company falls apart after leadership change. Investors flee as stocks crash. Will the company survive? CEO Richard's biggest mistake, firing the wrong man? Richard had never been this desperate before. His hands were shaking as he dialed number after number, trying to get new investors. Trying to fix the damage. But no one trusted him anymore. "We're not taking that risk," one investor told him coldly before hanging up. Richard felt sick. "I have to fix this. I have to," he mumbled to himself. Then, suddenly, a new email appeared in his inbox. Subject, urgent, meeting with the majority shareholder. Richard's stomach dropped. The majority shareholder? The one who had been silent all this time. He had never met the real owner before. He had assumed it was some unknown investor, hiding in the shadows. But now, that person wanted to meet. Maybe they can save us," Richard whispered to himself, grabbing his coat and rushing out of his office. He had no idea what was coming. Richard sat in the boardroom, his fingers nervously tapping the table. The air was thick with tension as the remaining executives whispered among themselves. They were all waiting for the majority shareholder, the mysterious figure who had stayed in the shadows all these years. Richard adjusted his tie, trying to hide his anxiety. This was his last chance to save the company. Whoever this person was, he needed their help. Suddenly, the door swung open. A man stepped in. Dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, his presence commanded instant respect. His posture was calm, confident, and completely in control. The executives stopped whispering. The room fell completely silent. Richard's breath caught in his throat. His body tensed. Because standing before him was Michael. The same man he had mocked, disrespected, and fired. The same man who owned everything. Richard felt his world tilt. "No, this isn't possible," he stammered. His throat was suddenly dry. Michael slowly stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He placed his hands on the table, leaning in just slightly. And then, in a voice so calm it sent chills down Richard's spine, he spoke. "I was never just an employee. I own this place." A collective gasp filled the room. Executives exchanged shocked glances. Some had their mouths slightly open, trying to process what they had just heard. One of them whispered, "Michael? The majority shareholder?" Another muttered, "This can't be real," but it is. Richard, still frozen in his seat, felt the color drain from his face. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. He had fired the man who controlled everything. Michael straightened up, adjusting his cufflinks. "I gave this company my loyalty for years," he said, his voice steady, "and what did I get in return?" Richard opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Michael's gaze pierced through him. "You thought you were getting rid of me. But you were just digging your own grave." The silence in the room was deafening. Richard's hands were shaking now. "Michael, I didn't know." Michael tilted his head slightly. "That's the problem, Richard. You never cared to know. The humiliation, the disrespect, the betrayal, it was all coming back to haunt him. And there was nothing he could do to stop it." The room was still silent, the weight of Michael's words hanging over everyone like a heavy storm cloud. Richard looked pale, his usually confident demeanor completely shattered. Michael turned, his sharp gaze scanning the boardroom. Every single person in the room had once dismissed him, belittled him, and watched as he was humiliated. And now? They were staring at him in disbelief. Michael finally spoke, his tone calm but undeniably powerful. "Let's talk about business." Michael pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. He opened it, flipping through a few pages before stopping at one. Then, without looking up, he said the words that sent a chill down Richard's spine. "Richard Stevenson, you're fired." Richard's head snapped up. What? Michael finally met his gaze, his expression unmoved. "You heard me. Pack your things. You no longer work here." A few of the executives gasped. Richard stood up so fast his chair nearly fell over. "Michael, you can't do this. I built this company." Michael raised an eyebrow. "You built this company?" A small smirk played on his lips. "Funny, I don't remember you being there when I was working late nights to make sure this place survived." Richard's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Michael leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to an icy calm. "You forced me out. You laughed in my face. And now? Now you're nothing." Richard staggered back, as if the words had physically hit him. "Security will escort you out," Michael added, gesturing to the door. "Right on cue, two security guards stepped inside. Richard looked at them in horror. "Wait, let's talk about this. I can fix this, Michael. Please." Michael didn't even blink. "Get out." Richard's face twisted in anger, but there was nothing he could do. He had lost everything. As the security guards grabbed his arms, he shouted in protest, but no one defended him. The same executives who once blindly followed him now stayed silent. Richard was dragged out of the boardroom. His reign was officially over. Michael turned his attention to Ryan, the so-called replacement. The young man sat frozen, sweat forming on his forehead. Michael sighed. "And you?" Ryan flinched. "Mr. Michael, sir, listen. I was just following orders. I never meant to." Michael held up a hand, and Ryan immediately shut up. "You disrespected me. You treated me like I was nothing. You thought this job was about looking important, but you couldn't even do the basics." Ryan swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Michael leaned in. "Let me make this clear. You are just as much of a failure as Richard. And like him." He paused for effect. "You're fired too." Ryan gasped. "No, please. Give me another chance. I can prove myself." Michael shook his head. "I don't give second chances to people who never respected me in the first place." Ryan dropped his head, knowing there was no use arguing. Security came back and escorted him out as well. Michael didn't even bother watching him leave. He had bigger things to do. The remaining employees sat quietly, waiting for their fate. Some looked guilty. Others looked scared. Michael looked at them all and spoke firmly. "Loyalty matters. Respect matters. When you throw people away for your own greed, it always comes back to haunt you." Some of them nodded, ashamed. Michael continued. "I remember every single person who stood by me. And I remember those who didn't." He reached for another file. "Effective immediately, I'm rehiring the employees who were loyal to this company. The real workers. The ones who kept this place running." The room stirred. Some employees smiled in relief. Then Michael added, "And I'm bringing in a new management team. A better one." The executives shifted uncomfortably. They knew what that meant. Their time was running out. By the next day, the company was already transforming. The toxic leadership was gone. Old, loyal employees returned. New investors saw Michael's leadership and started coming back. The headlines changed. Company saved by mysterious billionaire, Michael takes over as CEO. Fired boss faces ruin as ex-employee turns out to be the true owner. And Richard? He had lost everything. Michael, now sitting in the CEO's office, leaned back in his chair, looking out at the city skyline. He had won. And justice had been served. Michael stood by the floor-to-ceiling window in his CEO office, overlooking the city skyline. The company was finally his, and this time, it was in the right hands. The last few months had been a whirlwind of change and growth. New leadership had turned the company around. Employees felt valued again, morale was at an all-time high. Clients returned, eager to work with a company that actually cared about quality. Stock prices soared, proving that Michael's strategy was exactly what the business needed. Michael had taken a company that was collapsing and rebuilt it into something stronger. And best of all? This time, he was the one in charge. Meanwhile, Richard was a completely different man. Gone was the arrogant boss who once mocked Michael. Now, he was just another desperate man searching for work. "I'm sorry, but we don't have a position for you. Your leadership history, it's too risky for us." No investors want to associate with someone who tanked their own company. The rejection emails kept coming. And the worst part? The business world was small. Everyone knew what happened. Richard wasn't just unemployed, he was unhireable. His former employees refused to work with him. Investors wanted nothing to do with him. And the ones who once shook his hand and called him sir, they now ignored his calls. He had burned too many bridges, and now he was paying the price. Sitting alone in his small apartment, Richard stared at his bank account balance. The numbers were dropping fast. He had gone from CEO to nothing. And the worst part? Michael hadn't even lifted a finger. Karma had done all the work. As for Ryan, the young replacement, he had been just as arrogant as Richard, thinking he was untouchable, that power was handed to him, not earned. But now? He finally understood. No one wanted to hire a failed leader. And worse? Michael's name carried weight now. Ryan had learned that when you disrespect the wrong person, it can cost you everything. One day, as he scrolled through LinkedIn, he saw an article trending. Under new leadership, the company sees record growth. Michael's picture was on the front page. Ryan stared at it, his stomach twisting with regret. That could have been him. But he had thrown away his chance by thinking he was better than the man who had built the company from the ground up. Now, he was just another nobody, searching for a job he didn't deserve. Back at the office, Michael walked through the halls. Employees greeted him with genuine respect. Some even stopped to thank him for saving the company. One of the older employees, a woman who had worked there just as long as Michael, approached him. "We always knew you were the heart of this company," she said. "It's about time the world knew it too." Michael smiled. This was the respect he had deserved all along. And now? He had finally earned it, not through arrogance or greed, but through patience, strategy, and knowing when to strike. As he stepped back into his office, he picked up a pen, signed a new lucrative business deal, and leaned back in his chair. Then, with a satisfied smirk, he whispered to himself, "Power isn't just about money. It's about patience, strategy, and knowing when to strike."